Am I going? I think I'm going. All right. So there have been some questions about the sort of nuts and bolts of the Pascal piece. And so, in a stunning turn of events, I'm a YouTuber now. Um, and I thought I would just give you guys quickly the rundown of what it is Pascal is saying, because I understand you do have to write your paper about this, um, and there is some confusion there. All right. So, can you tell I'm a theater fan in my childhood bedroom? All right. So what Pascal is talking about is he takes the approach that an historicist would take, right? Instead of saying, this is what the symbolism is, and he does do a little bit of that, but he also places The Haunting of Hill House in the context of what was happening at the time when Shirley Jackson was writing it. And so, since it was written in 1959, I guess you could still consider that the post World War II era. It had been over for a while, but what he's talking about is that the concept of parenting, right? This is something that is a skill set that didn't exist before World War II and the baby boom, and so one of the major questions of this new sort of parenting lifestyle is how do you strike the balance between being too authoritarian, the sort of Hugh Crane type parent, and too permissive, sort of like the mother of the little girl with the cup of stars. Shirley herself was very into this. She seems to have been a bit of, actually, a lot of, a lot on the permissive side. Pascal talks about she has two memoirs, Raising Demons and Life Among the Savages, that specifically talk about her life with her children. And she did have four of them. So there's a couple of places in the text that I want to draw your attention. So if we take a look at I'm using the large page numbers at the bottom of the page. So this is 101, sort of in the middle of the page. The most famous of Jackson's novels, The Haunting of Hill House, conjured up post-war America's disturbing anxieties about the modern family, with wit, acuteness, and a healthy modicum of dread. In Hill House, the opening paragraph solemnly announces whatever walks there walks alone. In conformity with Gothic narrative convention, the whatever appears to be unidentifiable, even with regard to whether or not it is a single entity or a plurality or somehow both. Walking alone, as though on the prowl, connotes isolation, yet it may be what the whatever does in oxymoronic togetherness, or by way of some bizarre familial pact arrived at by disparate clashing wills. So what Pascal's argument here is, I don't really buy it, but he argues that there is more than one entity haunting Hill House. And the way that you can sort of square that with the whatever walks there walks alone is that while there are multiple entities, they're isolated from each other. So he talks a lot about the kind of father Hugh Crane was, and he, as we talked about in class, really equates him with the Old Testament God. He talks a lot about the picnic scene, which we can talk about because I just think he's wrong. But that does not mean that he is wrong, and it does not mean that you have to think he's wrong. So in terms of what this is going to mean for your papers, he is very focused on the ideas of parenting in The Haunting of Hill House. So he has a section where he talks about the heads on the nursery room door. He also talks about the idea of house as womb. And he says that Eleanor's journey, really her sort of Benjamin Buttonish regression, is to be, the phrase he uses is consumed into amniotic oneness with the house. So the amniotic sac being the thing that the baby grows in inside the womb. So he's talking about how Eleanor's journey in this novel is really to almost crawl back into the womb because she cannot get away from her mother. Now, in terms of mothers, if we look on page 102, he has this really interesting argument about a term that Philip Wiley calls momism. Such was the prevalence of the momism obsession, in print discourse at least, that only a few years after the appearance of Wiley's book, Erik Erikson could refer casually to a laterally emerging literary sport in books decrying the mothers of this country as moms, as a generation of vipers. Then it goes on to talk about the mother in Psycho and the Manchurian Candidate. Now, what this type of momism refers to is the kind of mother that Eleanor had. The mom with a capital M is very overbearing. She looks down on anything sexual, but at the same time, she indulges her own sexual fantasies. Pascal argues that we're sort of being signaled to think that because Eleanor had to read romance novels to her mother. Romance novels in the 1950s would not have been of the 50 Shades variety. But the fact that a grown woman has to read these to her mother is a little bit, or a lot bit strange. The other term he uses that you might not be familiar with is filiarchy, Filiarchy. You can think about it as a sort of child rule that is being ruled by children. He talks about this in conjunction with the Cup of Stars scene. So in the Cup of Stars scene, Richard Pascal argues that what we see happening is a mother giving in to her child, right? A permissive type of parent. And one of the anxieties about parenting in the 1950s was that if you were too permissive, your kid was going to be a brat. And another thing that I kind of don't really square with Pascal on. He argues that in the context of the 1950s, all evil leads to communism. So he talks about the concept of a red under the bed, right? That would be a communist in your own house. Shirley was not too concerned with that stuff. She and her husband were accused of being communists, mostly because her husband was Jewish. You can sort of read her famous story, The Lottery, with a communist eye, I guess. But it doesn't really appear too much in Hill House. So one of the quotes that appears on the Blackboard page has to do with why the entities that terrorize Theodora and Eleanor seem like both parents and children. And that ties into what Pascal is talking about with the idea that if you give children too much power, they will become like the parents, and then chaos will reign. He gives some examples of this sort of anxiety cropping up in other texts from the 1950s. The novel and the movie The Bad Seed. There's also a Twilight Zone episode called It's a Good Life. It has that really famous line, like, I'm going to send you to the cornfield. Basically what happens in the episode is a small child has power to literally banish people, make them disappear. He'll turn you into a jack-in-the-box. He'll send you to the cornfield and you'll never come back. So this idea that kids were going to take over the world was not unheard of. Like, Shirley would not have been completely unfamiliar with it. The other thing I wanted to talk about has to do with the picnic scene. Now, this is one place in which Pascal and I really split. I had hoped to be able to talk about this with you, but if we look on page 114. So he talks about how in the scene where Eleanor and Theodora are following the path to the picnic, they have to pass through what he calls an annihilation of whiteness. So if you reread that scene, it's almost like the scene in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy, she crash lands in the house, everything is black and white, and then she walks out the door into Oz where things are in color. So really, that's kind of the same thing that's happening when Eleanor and Theodora reach the end of the path. And Pascal's argument is to attain it, to be that child in the scarlet jumper, so like the red sweater that is her one flamboyant article of clothing, Eleanor would have to pass through the annihilation of whiteness that is her death. This foreshadowed is what Theodora witnesses when she casts the backward glance she warns Eleanor not to emulate, and why she repeats her name and embraces her when the incident is finally over. So it seems to me that what Pascal is arguing here is that Theodora, with her maybe psychic powers, foresees the way Eleanor is going to die. I don't buy that for a lot of reasons, but I've had students in the past who have written papers that successfully argued that yes, Theodora did see Eleanor's death here. if that's something that you want to explore, you certainly can. Other important stuff. One of my favorite parts about this article happens on page 117. He quotes the scene where Luke is talking about how many circles there are in Hill House and how much of the decor is based on round things. So he quotes, perhaps the single most repulsive aspect is the emphasis upon the globe. The lampshade made of tiny pieces of broken glass glued together. And again, this is Luke speaking. The great round balls of the lights upon the stairs, the fluted iridescent candy jar, and an Easter egg of sugar with a vision of shepherds dancing inside. A bosomy lady supports the stair rail on her head. So remember we talked about yonic imagery. I don't mean to be graphic, but it connotes breasts as much as it does the uterus. So remember, this is Luke speaking, and he has his mama issues. And so when he says this is a mother house and everything is circular, there's a lot of anxiety tied up with that for Luke. All right. There's some stuff in here about the narcissism that Freud talks about. I know you guys in my evening class are interested in that.